Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this esteemed panel. When considering the ongoing conflicts that we've been hearing about, it's important to think about, in addition to the geopolitical and ideological dynamics, the nature and functioning of the global arms trade that feeds these conflicts, intensifies the massive abuses of human rights, and which undermines the prospects for peace. I've been investigating and researching the trade for over 15 years, ever since, as an ANC Member of Parliament in South Africa, I was stopped from investigating a $10 billion arms deal in which $300 million of bribes were paid. To put this in some sort of context, global military expenditure is estimated to have totaled $1.75 trillion in 2014. That is $250 for every person on the planet. The small arms trade is worth around $8.5 billion. Around 5 million firearms are sold every year, and every year, on average, 526,000 violent deaths occur through warfare and murder, most of them by a weapon. The United States buys and sells almost as many weapons as the rest of the world combined. Other major producers of weaponry include Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Israel, and China. These countries sell weapons through their large government-subsidized defense companies. Last year, 2014, the biggest buyer of weapons in the world was Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, Turkey, Israel, and India also increasing their purchases significantly. While quite obviously an important dimension of national defense, a tool of foreign policy, including sometimes covert foreign policy, and a contributor, albeit overstated, to the economy, the arms trade, big and small, has additional profound impacts on the world. From the enabling, fueling, and perpetuation of conflict and repression, to the corrosion of democracy and human rights. Arms deals stretch across a continuum of legality and ethics, from the official or formal trade on the one side to the black market or illicit trade on the other. Between these two extremes sits what we call the grey market, what I describe as the shadow world of arms purchases. But in fact, in practice, the boundaries between these three markets are extremely fuzzy. They're almost always intertwined and dependent on each other. With bribery and corruption commonplace, there are very few arms transactions that do not involve some element of illegality, most often through intermediaries, middlemen, agents, or what is sometimes referred to as arms dealers. And many arms dealers who provide services to large defense companies and governments continue to operate in the black and grey markets. An arms dealer who I interviewed for the first time for the book of The Shadow World, who had been in the industry for over 50 years, described to me how, when he saw a UN arms embargo imposed, it was for him a dollar sign, because it meant that he could charge a premium. Having supplied weapons into most of the world's conflict, with an outlook that I could only describe as neo-Nazi, this gentleman operates actively and regularly for all of the world's most powerful nations and biggest weapons manufacturers. One of the reasons he continues to do what he does with impunity is because for many of those governments, he is an intelligence asset. And sadly, the nature of his business and his undertaking is one of hundreds, if not thousands, of similar operations in various parts of the world. A study conducted by Joe Rober, then of Transparency International, calculated that the trade in weapons accounts for almost 40% of all corruption in all global trade. The US Department of Commerce undertook a study of 5 years of corrupt transactions involving American businesses. Over 50% of those corrupt transactions were in the defense sector. So why is this trade so susceptible to corruption and other forms of malfeasance? Rober argued that the arms trade is hardwired for corruption. Corruption and illegality is not an occasional and unfortunate side effect of an arms deal, but it is built into the very structure of the trade. You have just a few contracts every year worth tens of billions of dollars being decided on by a very small number of people in the buying countries, all operating behind a national security imposed veil of secrecy. And sadly, this creates perfect conditions for rampant corruption and other illegality. The consequences of this malfeasance and the efforts to conceal it include the corrosion of democratic institutions and the rule of law, not just in the buying countries, but also in the selling countries. Greater instability in fragile states, massive opportunity costs, especially in relation to socio-economic development, and sometimes an undermining of the very national security that the deals are supposed to bolster. This scenario worsens in times of conflict, where procedures and checks and balances seldom exist, where time is of the essence and very few questions are asked. Crucially, those involved in this trade wield enormous political influence through the phenomenon of what is described as the revolving door, the movement of people between positions in government, politics, the military, intelligence agencies, and this network of vast defense companies. The consequences of this are a distortion of policy making, not just in the ascendancy of war making over diplomacy, but also in foreign and economic policy decisions. A crucial dimension of these arrangements that is often overlooked is the link between defense companies, arms dealers, and political parties. This trade plays an absolutely central role in party political funding all over the world. The national security elite not only wields enormous power while they are enriching themselves, but also operate in something of a parallel legal universe, as they very seldom face the legal consequences of their often illegal actions. To give you but one example, of the 502 violations of UN arms embargoes that we recorded for the book, together with a research team from the University of British Columbia, 502 violations, only 2 have ever resulted in any legal action whatsoever. 1 resulted in a conviction. In addition, the trade in weapons suffers remarkable degrees of what is referred to as blowback, the unexpected consequence of any action which are the opposite of that which the action intended. In the arms trade, blowback results in weapons sold that often land up in the wrong hands or even being turned against the very countries that sold them. The NATO bombings of Libya during the late period of the Gaddafi regime were noteworthy for the reality that the targets of those bombings were often weapons systems sold to Libya by the very countries undertaking the bombings. The ultimate political blowback is probably Afghanistan, where the multi-billion-dollar arming of the Mujahideen was key to the creation of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Which brings us to Iraq and Syria. Arms dealers, including the gentleman I referred to earlier, who takes great pride in telling me that not only has he sold to the Assad regime in Syria for decades, but that now in his 80s he is making more money than at any other time in his career selling to most of the protagonists in the Syrian conflict. He's not constrained by ideology. He's not constrained by regulations, laws, or embargoes. He operates by only one rule. He will supply to anyone who will pay him. The world's most powerful nations' failure to clamp down on these dealers because they often use them for covert foreign policy or as intelligence assets is very sadly coming home to roost. But it is the populations of Syria and Iraq who are suffering the consequences. And it is the strategies of the world's most powerful nations in the region that is also at fault. As we discovered in Iraq, intelligence in the region is extremely difficult to garner and is often unreliable and faulty. So the alliances between powerful governments and the various groups on the ground are in a state of constant flux. This, sadly, is fertile ground for regular and inevitable blowback. So weapons sold or brought into the region, on whichever side in these complicated conflicts, serve not to aid peace, but primarily to worsen the severity and fatal consequences of the fighting. If we have learned anything from history, it is this. In addition, the objectives in the region of the world's most powerful countries are themselves in a state of regular flux. But arming a few of the key protagonists in the region, a number of whom have brought more weapons than any other countries on the planet over the past 18 months, is highly unlikely to contribute to peace. The profound irony of the current situation is that the tidal wave of refugees are going predominantly to the countries that are the biggest suppliers of weapons to the conflicts these refugees are fleeing. As we sit here today, the world's largest arms fair is taking place in my home city of London, where most of the protagonists in the conflicts we are talking about will be restocking their armories. So what can we do? In general terms, as even the illiberal industrialist Henry Ford said, show me who makes a profit from war, and I'll show you how to stop the war. We have numerous national, regional, and international regulations, but most are barely applied because of the economic and political interests that would be affected by their rigorous application. Let us demand zero-tolerance enforcement so that no weapons could be sold to any of the protagonists, both directly and indirectly involved in these two conflicts. Let us ensure that individual arms dealers active in the region, and by the nature of what I have said, it should be clear to you that the authorities that could police such action know exactly who these people are. Let us ensure that these people are locked up if they sell into these countries, regardless of whose intelligence assets they might be at any particular time. If there is not the political will to do this, which currently I don't believe there is, then each of us, as citizens of the world, have to say no more to the countries involved, starting with the voters and taxpayers in each of the world's major weapons makers. Because after all, it is their tax dollars that subsidize the arms manufacturers. For if we don't stop the flow of weapons into these conflicts, the slaughter of hundreds of thousands will continue unabated, and the tragic march of millions fleeing conflict, human rights abuses, and extreme instability will become a permanent drumbeat of desperation and anguish. Thank you.